Hello, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Besseling. I'm the Executive Director at EXX Africa. We are a political risk advisory on Africa, providing analysis and forecasts on political, economic and security risks. It is a real pleasure to be able to join you virtually this year at GTR East Africa. And indeed, I hope to see many of you again in person when times allow us to do so again. At the end of this pre-recorded version, I hope that we will be able to bring me back in live to answer any of your questions. And today I will be trying to address a key theme about mapping the post-pandemic risk landscape for African trade and infrastructure investment. Now let's start by looking at the economic impact of COVID-19 and what this has meant for socio-economic indicators, country risk indicators, as well as the economic outlook and the potential for recovery in 2021 and beyond. Now, over the course of the pandemic, Africa has seen a cumulative number of almost 1.5 million infections of the novel coronavirus. Have to note that almost half of these have been in South Africa, Africa's most industrialized economy, from where I join you today. Now that is closely followed by the major population centers to the north of Africa, close to Europe, particularly in Egypt, Morocco and Algeria. And those are closely followed by the major population centers in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly those in the Gulf of Guinea in the west, as well as Ethiopia, Africa's second most populous country in the east of Africa. We can tentatively say that Africa has seen the worst of its first wave of infections. Most of Africa's countries are now well clear of its first peak. However, there are already concerns that unlocking economies too soon and opening up countries to international travel and dropping social distancing measures will allow for a second wave to hit many parts of Africa. There are already concerns that Morocco and Egypt will see a second wave over the next month or so. This, of course, is very much impacting how we are viewing the country risk outlook for Africa's countries. In April, at the midst of the pandemic, ex-Africa revised many of its ratings, its one-year risk ratings for many African countries. This includes political indicators, contract risks, security risks, sovereign debt, as well as broader economic outlook risk indicators. As you can see here, about 3/4 of Africa's countries were rated in the red severe category or the high risk category in the orange. Very few countries at the moment are rated in elevated or moderate, and none in the low category. In October, ex-Africa will amend many of these ratings based on its quarterly review system. And by the time you see this presentation, we will have amended many of these countries, and particularly countries in West or East Africa, whose economic indicators have remained relatively strong, as well as countries in those regions which have received international acclaim for managing the coronavirus well, according to relative standards, will receive an upgrade by us in terms of their risk rating outlook. And we hope to see many of these countries steering towards the elevated, moderate, or even low risk categories over the course of the next 3 months. Please do take a look at our website to see the latest risk ratings for Africa's 54 countries. At the same time, in October, we are eagerly awaiting the World Economic Outlook by the IMF, which should again showcase many of the worst performers and the best performers in Africa as well as around the world. Africa's worst economic performers are very much focused on countries that are too dependent on single commodity exports, like Botswana for diamonds, or Equatorial Guinea on oil, as well as Nigeria, which may see a 9% economic contraction based on the latest indicators. These ones here are actually the ones from the last World Economic Outlook from April. So we are very much looking forward to see the new IMF World Bank figures. And unfortunately for many of these countries, these forecasts, like for example for Nigeria, are said to be worse than initially envisaged. However, a number of Africa's economies will do relatively well. And the top performers for 2020 in Africa include many economies in West and East Africa. These are countries which have an economically diversified base, countries with a sound economic governance system, which has allowed structural reforms to take place over the course of the pandemic. And these are also countries which have managed the public healthcare crisis to the best of their abilities, and have been able to pioneer new innovative ways of dealing with the health crisis in their regions. These include countries like Benin, or Senegal, or Ivory Coast in West Africa, as well as Uganda, Rwanda, and Ethiopia in East Africa. Although, based on the latest numbers, countries like Ethiopia might not actually reach that 3.2, 3.3% economic growth this year. We believe it may be closer to 2%. And again, I mentioned that we're looking forward to seeing those IMF forecasts coming out in October. What will not change too much, however, is the sub-regional GDP growth outlook for many of Africa's regions. South Africa is really dragging down the rest of Southern Africa's region. Central Africa went into the pandemic high on debt and weak on growth. Similarly, North Africa, facing a number of crises in Algeria or in Tunisia or Libya, again, will have a more difficult 2020 than initially envisaged. In East Africa and in West Africa, that's likely where we will see some sort of moderate growth in 2020, and almost certainly a sound economic recovery towards 2021 and beyond. This again is mostly because of countries having a more diversified economic base and having been able to implement a number of key structural economic reforms. GTR East Africa, of course, covers many of these East African countries, and therefore here I'm shortlisting 6 major East African countries. Now again, these are based on IMF data from April, which is set to be updated in October. And countries like, for example, Ethiopia or Kenya may not be able to achieve these forecasts of growth after all. It'll be interesting to watch as we reach the final quarter of this year if any real change, incremental change, can be achieved in these economies, and whether that will benefit an economic recovery from next year onwards. Let's take a look at the countries most at risk of a critical destabilization in the one-year outlook based on the political, economic, security and sovereign debt ratings that we have given many of these countries. We have produced at Ex-Africa a model that looks at each African country, which builds in demographics, builds in the number of infections and the death rate, as well as existing country risk ratings, as well as a number of other factors. Based on our model, our COVID-19 country risk vulnerability model, countries with economically diversified bases will be most resilient to the pandemic. However, countries overly dependent on single commodities, countries which are already in periods of conflict or political chaos, or countries that went into the pandemic with a weak economic outlook or a very unsustainable debt outlook, are most likely to face a critical destabilization. This includes a country like Zimbabwe, for example, where we still forecast some sort of an unconstitutional intervention over the course of 2020 to oust the current government, which has been unable to cope with the pandemic. In order to remain updated on our forecasts and our country risk model, you're very welcome to take a look at our COVID-19 dashboard on exxafrica.com, where we provide open access for the remainder of the pandemic to all our COVID-19 content. Now, let's take a look at some of the sectors at greatest risk of disruption. And it really cannot be a surprise that the oil and gas and aviation sectors, so the broader tourism sectors, will remain at the greatest risk of disruption even beyond the pandemic. Just looking here at this map of Africa in terms of major oil projects, many of these are currently being reviewed and some have already been cancelled. For East Africa, this includes the South Lokoshar project in Kenya, being developed by Aker Energy. Or in Uganda, it includes the Telenga project or the Kingfisher South project, developed by Tullow Oil, Total, and CNOOC of China. These countries in East Africa were hoping to join Africa's oil exporting club over the next few years. The timeline for that, however, now has been completely warped, and the development of many of these projects is in doubt. It is, of course, interesting that Uganda and Tanzania have recently signed off on a $3.5 billion pipeline project to ship oil from the Lake Albert Basin to the Indian Ocean. So some developments will continue despite some uncertainty over a number of key projects in East Africa. Similarly, Africa's gas potential is under pressure. And again, here, a number of projects in East Africa are at risk of review, delay, or outright cancellation. This includes some big projects in the nascent LNG sector of Tanzania, as well as potential delays to the much larger and much more advanced projects in Mozambique, including Coral FLNG or Area 4 and Area 1. And we're likely to see much more activity in terms of buy-ins or buyouts in these projects over the next few months. Even though, however, a number of these projects are reaching final investment decision and have reached their targets in terms of financing and are likely to move ahead regardless. Africa's aviation industry, however, is very much dependent, not just on Africa opening up, but the rest of the world. Therefore, any second wave in Africa or globally would take the aviation industry in Africa, as well as the broader travel and tourism industry and supply chain, of course, into serious distress. Some carriers in East Africa, like Ethiopian Airways, have been able to survive the pandemic by shifting from passenger to cargo airflows. And that has been the saving grace for Ethiopia's national carrier. Kenya Airways, however, has required yet another state bailout and will remain state dependent and requires urgent restructuring moving forward. Similarly, Tanzania, whose president, John Magufuli, had hoped to rapidly expand its aviation capacity and revamp its former national air carrier, those ambitions have now also been pushed aside. Several other African countries like Zambia, for example, again, their hopes to join a national aviation industry will be dashed for the foreseeable future. Now let's take a look at the impact of COVID-19 and the economic crisis on trade in Africa. Now, the share of trade in African GDP is 56%. Yet intra-regional trade is comparatively low. In fact, 80 to 90% of exports from Africa are to the rest of the world. Most of these go to the European Union, China, and the US. 90% of African economies remain resource dependent. Hence my point earlier that economically diversified countries are much more likely to come out of this faster than others, and trade is set to resume in a more sustainable manner in these more diversified economies. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted African trade due to the twin shock to global supply chains as well as global demand. Global trade values dropped by 3% in the first quarter of this year, and then by almost a third in the second quarter of this year. We're expecting some sort of improvement to these numbers in the third quarter, and we're eagerly awaiting these figures. But in the meantime, we can say or assess that Africa has faced three waves that have hit its trade. One, from a slowdown in China. Secondly, from a slowdown in the Western world, or the OECD, particularly in Europe. And thirdly, also from within Africa itself. Let's look at these individually. Let's look at the impact from China. China's GDP contracted by 6.8% in the first quarter of this year. That resulted in a 14% drop in African trade. It remains no surprise that Africa's largest trading partner, the dependence on African resources and commodities drives China's economy. And it's been a very difficult year for many companies and countries that have been very much dependent on exporting to China. Secondly, there has been a real impact from a drop of growth in the Eurozone. The Eurozone contracted by 14.4% in the first quarter alone. That means that many African countries, which are dependent on exporting to Europe, such as Cape Verde, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Liberia, and various others, have taken a very serious knock. Here you can see some of the countries whose exports to Europe are above the average. And indeed, countries like Seychelles and Mauritius, for example, are very much taking a knock in terms of their economic outlook this year, with severe economic contractions expected this year, and no potential for economic recovery on the maps yet for the year ahead. And then thirdly, Africa's economies have also taken a knock because they have been locked down internally. Despite the lack of intra-regional trade, there has still been a real impact, particularly on the informal trading networks across Africa, particularly those around West Africa or East Africa, with Nigeria and Kenya acting as trade channels. And similarly, the flow of manufactured goods and imports across the continent being impacted by supply chain disruption, as many countries locked down or imposed curfews, closed their borders, or implemented travel bans. This has also, of course, impacted the development and the implementation of Africa's landmark free trade agreement, which we've been talking about at length already at this conference and many others. The AFCFTA has been derailed in terms of its roadmap for 2020, but we remain hopeful that its implementation can be put on track towards the end of this year and into next. We cannot, however, underestimate the impact or the economic costs that COVID-19 has had on Africa. African trade will drop by at least 35% this year, at an estimated loss of $270 billion. It will also cause the first recession in Africa in 25 years, which can be anywhere between a contraction of 2.1% or a contraction of 5.1%. It could in fact be even deeper, looking at what's going on in the major economies like like Nigeria and South Africa. Many commodity-dependent states will come out of this pandemic very vulnerable, particularly the oil-dependent economies like Angola, Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, and various others. These will be the countries to watch as we come out of the pandemic. And particularly also, these will be the countries to watch in terms of debt sustainability. Many African countries have sought new resources to deal with the pandemic and to provide economic stimulus. This leads us to my final, potentially for some of you the most important topic of this presentation, and that's the risk of default in Africa. At ex-Africa, we have been forecasting a wave of defaults across many vulnerable African economies over the course of this year and next. And in fact, we've already started to see this, where non-payment risks have become far more prominent in countries like Zambia, Republic of Congo, and various others across the spectrum. Delayed payments have become the norm in many countries in Africa over the course of the past 6 months or so, and that is likely to remain a key risk moving forward. What is being done about this? Well, we all know about this debt relief measure being imposed or proposed by the G20 and the Paris Club in association with the major multilaterals like the IMF and the World Bank. About 39 African countries are currently eligible to apply or qualify for this G20 debt moratorium. However, a number of Africa's least developed countries are also expressing their interest in applying for debt relief. However, the G20 proposal is simply pushing debt servicing requirements from this year into next. And that is causing a real problem, as it will accumulate the amount of debt servicing due in 2021 and beyond that as well, if or when the IMF and the World Bank, together with the G20, review their current debt relief offer at the October autumn meetings that are due in the next few weeks. I think it is very interesting that the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, under its current parameters agreed by the IMF and the World Bank, not yet considering any extension or expansion of the DSSI, only saves about $6.5 billion for Africa, even though about $200 billion is required. Most of this $6.5 billion is actually providing debt relief to Angola at the amount of $2.6 billion. Much smaller amounts are going to Kenya or West African economies or Ethiopia. And it is really interesting to see that Angola will be able to benefit most from this DSSI debt relief. Now, whether or not Angola makes full use of this is, of course, a different question. But I can say that a number of countries will not be able to apply. A number of countries in Africa have essentially been blacklisted by the IMF. This includes the usual suspects that are in arrears to the IMF, like Eritrea, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. Sudan, however, may soon be dropped from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism, with negotiations underway. This may mean some sort of relief for Sudan may become more likely in the next few months. However, the IMF has recently also added Zambia and the Republic of Congo to this blacklist, which means that these countries will not be considered for extensive debt relief or be considered for extensive new programs based on Zambia's and the Republic of Congo's continued accumulation of new debt, as well as their lack of transparency over existing project finance and export prepayment facilities. A number of African countries really should be applying, not just to debt relief, the DSSI, but to seek broader multilateral financing to help them mitigate the risk of the coronavirus pandemic, but also to help them provide economic stimulus to their economies as these markets seek to recover into next year. This includes countries like Sudan, of course, but also countries with heavy debt in terms of bond markets or due to private creditors and commercial banks such as South Africa, Angola, Ghana, and Kenya. Not many of these countries are being considered for the G20 debt relief, and they will have to start making ad hoc deals with bilateral debt holders as well as commercial debt holders And that will have to continue over the course of the next few months or years. A country like South Africa, for example, is not yet completely out of the woods, and there is still a real prospect of the IMF stepping in with a fully conditional program to help bail out South Africa's state-owned enterprises, which are the major drag on that country's economy. Similarly, in East Africa, countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, their debt sustainability position is becoming weaker. We are seeing more reports of foreign exchange shortages, delayed payments, or even non-payments made on a variety of facilities in these countries. And this is really why the presence of the multilaterals, alongside, of course, the bilaterals and commercial creditors, will be absolutely crucial. Africa needs about $200 billion to respond to this pandemic, according to the United Nations Economic Commission. And the major debt servicing requirements for this year include $44 billion in interest payments that remain still payable for this year. The DSSI, therefore, with its $6.5 billion, is not nearly sufficient to meet these requirements to help African countries meet their debt servicing. The US, China, and India have rejected a blanket debt relief for for the African continent. And significant Chinese debt in many African countries remains the real reason why the US and others refuse to bail out a number of African countries. So all of this leads to the major question is whether, as these multilaterals step in with expanded credit facilities, whether their credit ratings will come under pressure. Now, the IMF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and many others are engaging in innovative ways and creative ways to lend to African countries to help them deal with the fallout over the coronavirus pandemic and to provide economic stimulus. And together with the credit ratings agencies, we hope that these multilaterals' AAA ratings will not be impacted. In fact, there are potentially far greater non-payment risks in other parts of the world than currently exist in Africa, particularly as the African continent has not taken the brunt of the pandemic's outlook at the moment. In fact, the coronavirus pandemic in Africa has not played out according to that doomsday scenario, those negative scenarios that we heard at the beginning of the pandemic some 6 months ago. This has created some real opportunities for Africa in terms of structural reform and continued moves for economic diversification and a broader export base, which in the end, it is hoped, will benefit trade, intra-regional, as well as broader trade outside of Africa. And similarly, it will create new opportunities for African sectors such as renewables, IT, trade digitization, and supply chain maximization. Based on that momentum, we hope that Africa will be able to boost its trade and investment moving forward and to swiftly find a new and more sustainable economic recovery into 2021 and beyond. On that more hopeful or optimistic note, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank GTR also for hosting us virtually today. And of course, if you do have any questions or would like a copy of my presentation, you're very welcome to email me at insight@xafrica.com or ask GTR to put you in touch directly. Thank you again, stay well and stay safe.